What was hard for me in thinking about a career outside of city management was it's addicting stuff, right? I mean, there's no aspect of people's life that you don't impact in one way or another. The churn of city management is so much fun because you're constantly on fifth gear. The range of issues that you deal with in city management is fascinating. You know, who else gets to move from issues involving fresh water protection to issues involving libraries to issues involving public safety in the course of a single day? And it was that range, it was that pace that I just loved. But in shifting to a different kind of career, I started thinking about other things that I would like to do that I had never done, like leave a building during the day. Express a professional opinion because it was mine, because I felt strongly about the issue, because I was going to advocate for it, not based on a neutral assessment providing choices, but to come out flat out and advocate for things that I thought were important. I was really, really interested in a global component to my career. And so when I started thinking about shifting, a recruiter came to me from the Nature Conservancy. By the way, the Nature Conservancy is the oldest, largest conservation organization in the world. We work in all 50 states and 35 countries. And when the recruiter approached me to participate in this recruitment, what was interesting to me was how they were profiling for the job. It might be interesting to some of you all too as you think about public service in a very broad context, which I think is important. So the tradition in nonprofits, and you see this all the time, is usually the people that are leading nonprofits are the most passionate version of the mission, right? So in our case, a lot of state directors come up through conservation fields. They're natural scientists of one kind or another. The state trustees in Texas, so every state has a board of trustees, although there's only one national fiduciary board. They're a very sophisticated group of people. I've got the CEO of Mary Kay Cosmetics. I have CEOs of energy companies. I mean, these guys, I have to say this to the city managers. One thing that I really, really loved when I came over to the Nature Conservancy is that, first of all, I am fascinated by and strongly in favor of really, really good governance. It was never my goal to outthink a city council member, ever. I just think that good governance is one of the most interesting chemistry experiences you can have. The first difference that I noticed at the Nature Conservancy was this board of trustees are individually successful, comfortable in their skin, and not interested in doing my job. In fact, they're, right? I'm sorry, was that mean? In fact, what I found so striking is they feel so passionately about the work that we need to accomplish at the Nature Conservancy that one of their #1 goals is making sure I'm successful. Because if I'm successful, the organization is successful. And if the organization is successful, then the mission is successful. And that magic in the nonprofit world is alive and well and sits in pretty sharp contrast to public service that occurs within the government context. All that said, this board was looking to profile a slightly different kind of leader. I'm the 6th state director for Texas. The program in Texas is 50 years old. I'm the first person that is female. I'm the first person that comes from outside of the organization, and I am the first person that comes from a non-natural science or conservation background. And here's why. When I was transitioning into the Nature Conservancy, they were looking at their history, very satisfied with where the organization had been, but also very interested in shifting from incremental progress to exponential progress. And if you know much about Texas, that's a really, really insightful perspective. Texas's population sits at 25 million right now. We're going to double in the next 5 decades. The single most important natural resource problem that we have in Texas, bar none, is water. And if the state doesn't start getting it right with its natural resources, we're going to have some really, really big choke points. In fact, it's kind of amusing. Chambers of commerce from around the country are now sending our CEO community in Texas things like watering cans and other gift items saying, come to our state, we got water. And so they loved my background of city management. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. They were actually profiling for that kind of background. They liked the range. They liked the fact that I had overseen diverse functions, because believe it or not, in a big nonprofit, you oversee diverse functions as well. I've got everything from fundraisers, that was new, fundraisers to finance, to scientists, to conservation staff, to lobbyists. So it's a full range of services in a big nonprofit, and they knew they needed someone who could manage across that range. They knew they needed someone who could communicate with the public. So actually the private sector background was less interesting from that perspective, because your ability to be successful in the nonprofit world at this point has everything to do with whether or not you can talk about the mission and how you're going to achieve that mission. So the lesson for me in all of this is, first of all, public service is a big, big field. What you all are training in as students has all sorts of applications in city management, but also beyond that. I found it extremely, it was inspiring to shift careers. It was fun after 20 years to not be proficient, to be honest with you. I actually enjoyed coming in and saying to my staff, I don't know the technical aspects of this work very well, with the exception of water. So train me and train me well, because in a few years, you will eat what you shoot. And the staff had fun with that too, right? So it's just a little bit of a different version of city management. I mean, how many of us really know the intricacies of running an electric utility? What we do is we cultivate that expertise out of people and figure out how to mesh that with the priorities of a city. Okay, so that's a little bit about my public service career. By the way, my father was a professor at the University of Texas and taught educational administration. So throughout my, he passed away the year that I came to the Nature Conservancy. So we always, when I was in city management, he would always call me up and say, what's the juice at the city? And we always talked about the similarities between what school administrators and what city administrators have to go through. And there's tons and tons of similarities there. Let me shift gears now. Let me talk to you about what I see as the single most important challenge facing anybody anywhere near the public service. And that is figuring out how to reshape good conversations. We sit at a moment in time when most of the issues that have any complexity whatsoever are happening in the context of such broken down bad conversations that it's hard to get to any solutions. In fact, we've actually become a country of people who've gotten extremely articulate, really articulate, shockingly articulate about describing problems. We've gotten so good at describing problems that it's starting to substitute for talking for solutions. And we see this throughout every level of government and across every platform of complicated issues. So when I'm talking to people that are interested in public service, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the environment, whether it's local government management, whatever it is, the problem that we all have to solve together is how to reshape good conversations, because it's becoming a lost skill in this country, and it is absolutely interfering with our ability to solve really, really complicated problems. And because I think it's useful when you're trying to do things like this to use your sector as an example, I'm going to tell you what my view is of the environmental movement and how we almost became first in class in that exact problem. So when you think about conservation and the environment and think about sort of the history of this movement, so to speak, some of the names that come to mind, some of the early names were people like President Roosevelt, right? John Muir, people like that. And these were people who had this idea. The country was largely rural at the time, but it was urbanizing. And these were people that had this idea that all Americans had this innate connection to nature, and that part of what we had to do in public service was to make sure that those connections were made possible by protecting some of the best places in the country. So the original keystone piece of the environmental or conservation movement had a lot to do with protecting great places, beautiful places, places that Americans could go to and enjoy. And those of you that have studied the environment know that our national park system is the envy of the world, right? We were one of the brightest at it and very effective. Sometimes so effective that you got all sorts of interesting abuses of presidential power monuments. But the notion was positive, it was optimistic, and it was connective. We are going to save great places for Americans because Americans had a need for them and an appreciation for them. And as the movement went along, and by the way, we did a great job, right? And if you track state governments, states were doing the same things and cities were doing the same things. It was a very beautifully nested strategy where you had huge national parks, state parks, and then local parks. You also had, by the way, at the same time, organizations like the Nature Conservancy making contributions from the nonprofit side. There's an interesting history about how we nested into a lot of those acquisitions for the federal, state, and local governments. But as the country urbanized and industrialized, we started to see a slight shift of people moving into cities, and we also saw a shift that represented kind of a warning signal, and that was the destruction of natural resources, right? So in the beginning, we were thinking in terms of protecting natural resources. And by the way, the original notion of conservation was the simultaneous use and protection of natural resources. It was never intended to be one or the other. It was the idea that you had to share these natural resources in a growing economy, but also you had to protect them for future generations. That was the original notion. As we industrialized, we started to see the destruction of natural resources. You could by the time you can light Lake Erie on fire, you got a little bit of a warning sign that there's going to need to be some regulation. And so regulation was introduced. Now, interestingly, it was the EPA, you all know this, but the EPA, it's worth saying every chance you get just because it disrupts conventional wisdom, which is my favorite thing to do. The EPA was created by Nixon. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were written by Republicans. This was a time when we were solving problems not based on what primary we voted in. We were solving problems based on the substance of the problems themselves. And there was generalized agreement that as we were industrializing, we were seeing abuses that had to be managed, and they had to be managed with a regulatory framework. And nobody was arguing over whether or not you should or shouldn't have a regulatory framework. We just did it. And as we moved forward from there, in my view, the environmental movement started heading down that regulatory path and left some things behind. And that was aided by the fact that government started getting into really, really tight budgeting times. So you start to see significant declines in investments in state parks and in national parks. And you see really significant declines in the parks that existed and their overall maintenance. And so government's ability to maintain and add to these systems, and remember our population is still growing, was declining. At the same time, the environmental movement was further defining its mission in terms of the regulatory environment. And then if you just fast forward to climate change, we chose a portal, climate change, and we chose a subject matter, carbon, and we chose an industry, energy, and really, really started to dance on the head of a pin. And the ultimate pin that we danced on was a piece of federal legislation that failed. So we went from a movement that started out as being this wonderful, optimistic expression of the best in everyone to dancing on the head of a pin, and we lost. And so what you saw a few years ago, and you're still seeing, is those of us that are in the environmental space trying to figure out, now what? And you see whole national organizations that really shifted their entire staffing patterns around carbon, around climate legislation. Now, by the way, I work in a state where you really can't even say climate change. So I have experienced intimately how you have to figure out how to get people to care about natural resource protection in the context of such a polarized set of opinions on climate change. And by the way, the social research is in on this too, and this is great, this is helpful. We now know that if I walk into your office as an environmental organization and I start talking about climate change and you don't believe in it or the causes of it or what it's going to take to solve it, you're firmly in that camp. And I bring it all, man. I bring the hockey sticks, I bring the ice core samples, I've got every graph produced. I've got the National Science Academy papers, I've got it all. By the time I walk out of your office, you feel more strongly about your original opinion than when I walked in. This is how bad the conversation has gotten. And so part of what we're thinking about is, we're still looking at these global trends, and you all are aware of them. We're still looking at a world's population that is growing from 7 billion to 9 billion people. We're still looking at a trend, which is that we are becoming a fully urbanized planet. A fully urbanized planet. Everybody's living in cities. Nobody's moving to small towns or hamlets. People are moving to big cities and big areas like the one we're in today. We're looking at the fact that most of the natural resources that those cities depend on to grow their economies, to fuel their populations, are completely fixed assets. Water is a fixed asset. There is no more or less water on this planet today than there ever was. There's just 2 billion more people got to figure out how to share it. And we've got canaries in the coal mine. There are already 1 billion people that do not have adequate to appropriate water. That number grows to 2 billion people if you include sanitation. So we've got all sorts of canaries in the coal mine as it relates to natural resources, and yet we're kind of at an all-time low with how we get people to agree on how to solve those problems. So now what? This is what I spend my time thinking about. And I work in a state whose trajectory really matches the global conditions. So Texas is doubling in size. We're fully urbanized. Believe it or not, Texas has 6 of the 20 largest cities in the country. 86% of Texans live in one of 4 cities. We're not riding around on horses anymore in Texas. And yet, we've got an economy that's kind of interesting because we have a huge agricultural sector. We have a huge urban sector. So when I'm talking to you about shaping conversations, let me give you a couple of examples. Water is actually my favorite subject. Here's one way that water usually happens. And by the way, if you guys start talking about water, please don't say the line, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fun. Everybody in Texas says that like every 20 minutes right now. It is the standard opening line of all water speeches. There are 3 major categorical users of water on the planet. They are agriculture, which uses about 70% of all water, energy and industry, and cities. So in a state like Texas, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how you can have enough water for growing cities, agriculture, and the energy and industry that it will be the source of your growth of population. That's the challenge. The number one thing that happens in water, and just start looking for it, pick up The Economist and read about it. Look at anything in California, you'll see this. It is what I call the circular firing squad. Agriculture looks at cities and says, I actually don't have the problem. You're the one that has the problem because you're trying to grow. Energy and cities look at ag and say, not only are you using all the water, you've got super high water losses, and if you just stop wasting the water, I'd have enough for my growing city. And then you got energy and industry, which kind of cracked me out because they try to stay really, really quiet in that conversation. And they like to say things like, well, compared to you two, we don't use very much water after all, so maybe you should leave us alone, which is also not the right answer. So when I talk about shaping the right conversation, part of what we're trying to do, using water as an example, is really to teach people why that is such a set of false, forced trade-offs. The number one thing that a growing population is going to want to do, actually the top 3 things a growing population is going to want to do, is eat, drink, and turn the lights on. So it is a fool's game to ask the categorical users of water to choose amongst those 3. And really what we're talking about is how you optimize. This is the whole thing in natural resource protection now. It's about optimizing. It isn't about regulating down to the nth degree. It's about figuring out how to optimize the use and protection of natural resources. And conservation plays a really, really important role in that, staying on water as an example. You all have a really interesting set of water issues in this part of the country too, with your invasive species. And so water is one of those issues that's going to get everybody's attention. First of all, it's highly intuitive. It also has a really nice element from a public policy perspective that everyone sees themselves in water. One of my favorite ways to teach people how to talk about public policy issues is that you gotta talk about this stuff in a way that people can see themselves. If all you're seeing is me, you're not going to want to be part of the solutions. And people naturally see themselves in water because of super obvious reasons, which, by the way, is why water is going to be the new carbon when it comes to environmental solutions. It's far more intuitive. The other thing that we've got to figure out how to do as we optimize this conversation is sort of reteach habits. So part of what we're doing as an organization is looking at these megatrends, right? So we know what's happening around the world. The same pattern is happening in the United States. We're also looking at the overall drawdown on natural resources. We're thinking about how we can correct the conversation because we know, let me give you a great example of ways that you can solve the problem if you start to think about it differently. There's a part of Texas, South Texas, which has a pretty strong agricultural component to its water use. And it's got a pretty big couple of cities, not mega cities like Houston or Dallas, but some nice sized cities, Brownsville, down there in South Texas. And what we're finding is if we can talk the cities, so city managers, this is something interesting for you to think about. if we can talk those cities into financing the replacement of the irrigation equipment that is used in South Texas to water those fields, and that water supply becomes available, and so the ag users of that water contract back with the city so that the city has new water supply, and they got it by reducing the water losses in ag, then from my perspective, you just did a fabulous conservation project because you're at no net new. And so long as you're squeezing efficiencies out of existing water supplies, that is conservation. And these are the kinds of solutions that our organization actually loves to play with. We love doing things with rate structures. I think so much can be done with rate structures. Do you all have block rate structures for water and stuff like that? Do y'all run your water utilities? You do? Okay. So usually a conservation rate structure is something that's a block rate structure. The more you use, the more incremental price you pay. So it kind of punishes the pigs, right? But here's what the pigs are doing. They're watering lawns, at least in many parts of the country. They're watering lawns. Well, if you've got a great big lawn, what usually sits on a great big lawn? Well, a pretty nice house. And water is not priced such that those block rates really function as a deterrent. And so what we haven't done, and again, this is reshaping the conversation, so at least in arid parts of the country, those block rate structures are usually paired with a newspaper that publishes the top 10 water users every year. That's kind of, so it's sort of the shame approach to water use. But we're starting to look at what you could do with rate structures that would mimic electric utility rate structures. What if we functioned at a conservation consumption pattern for a year, and the utility either rebated or somehow recognized financially that we'd sold water back to the grid, just like many parts of the country do with solar panels. If you're contributing resources to the aggregated utility, then you're rewarded for that financially. These are the kinds of conversations we're going to have. I think the environmental movement is interestingly at both the bottom of the barrel, but I actually think we can climb out of it the fastest. And part of it is because this is not just the hippies movement anymore, right? There are not very many people in our country that don't understand what's going on when it comes to water. If you live in a coastal city, the coastal resilience issues are real. Post-Sandy New York is a whole new world, a whole new world. Let me shoot to the bottom line here, and then maybe we can take some questions. One of the things that we're looking at the Nature Conservancy is urban conservation. As we look up and look at these worldwide trends, we recognize that urban conservation is going to have to be the wave of the future for several reasons. First of all, it's growing cities that are putting so much pressure on natural resources. Second of all, everyone lives in a city. So if you want to impact people's thinking on conservation, you almost have to be working in an urban environment. And so one of the things that and cities are at kind of a unique position. You all can still make the value proposition to the public better than state or federal government. But cities are still struggling with citizens' love of increased taxes or increased utility bills. And one of the things that we have found and have worked all over the country on these programs is when we work on freshwater protection, coastal resilience, and clean air programs, and we introduce green solutions that can be paired with traditional gray solutions, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a little bit. What it does, it improves the value proposition in those local communities. And so we are able to get bond programs passed. We're able to get city financing for traditional kinds of work with non-traditional elements in it. I'll give you a quick example in each of those three substantive areas. Air. We did a partnership with Dow Chemical. The Nature Conservancy did a partnership with Dow Chemical and their single largest chemical manufacturing plant in the world, which sits right outside of Houston, Texas. And all in the world we were trying to figure out is, could we convince the engineers at Dow to think a little bit differently about natural resources? And we found two very surprising things. First of all, Dow basically sits in the water, so they get creamed by storms every once in a while, and even a very small outage is big, big bucks at Dow Chemical. So it is in their best interest to build a fortress around their plant, which they do. We went in and started looking at their capital improvement program and how they were looking at levees, and noticed that their engineers calculated marshes as though they were parking lots, flat paved items. And we said, a word about marshes. They're super, super good at wave attenuation. They're sponges, And they can actually contribute to the resiliency that you're trying to create for your plant. And we showed them how to calculate the effects of marshes. It immediately shrunk the CIP. The levee became shorter and smaller because they were recognizing the value of nature. Now here's what's nice about working for the Nature Conservancy. We shipped that straight up to New York at post-Sandy. And right now, some of the neighborhoods that they are rebuilding are incorporating these green solutions. One, because they're effective. Two, because they're so often cheaper. And three, because they improve the value proposition. Gray infrastructure just is not that sexy. But when you can improve the fisheries, when you can improve the air quality, when you can improve the freshwater protection through these non-traditional responses, citizens eat it up. And if you look at some of the stuff that's being talked about post-Sandy, a lot of what people are talking about are these non-traditional responses. The other thing we found with Dow that was interesting, and by the way, these can drive private sector investments into your stuff too. I love that. Dow Chemical, as an expanding chemical plant, obviously they've got to get air permits from the state. As they expand, they're going to pollute more, which means they've got to put bigger scrubbers in their plants. Scrubbers take the bad chemicals out of the air. They're extraordinarily expensive. We went in and showed Dow if they did a massive reforestation around one of the most important rivers in Texas, that they could qualify for air credits. And if they qualified for those air credits, they'd have to spend less money on their air scrubbers. And here's why Dow ate that up with a spoon. Houston, Texas, and the entire, I know you don't think of Houston, Texas as having trees, but let me just say, it does. And some of its largest state parks were completely devastated by the drought a few years ago. And so their urban tree canopy was completely creamed by the drought. And we are going to be able to drive these Dow chemical dollars into reforesting the city of Houston and a major river so that they can then invest less money in an air scrubber and still solve the same problem. We're seeing these solutions all over the place. In Central Texas, we've invested over $800 million with county money and city money in freshwater protection by protecting land that sits over aquifers so that you control what the pollutant load is going into those aquifers. We're working on a return on investment model that will allow that tool to be replicable all over the world. There's so many different ways that we can approach the combination of the problems that you're trying to solve and the solutions that we bring to the table. And this is the kind of thing that gives me hope that organizations like mine, movements like the environmental organization, can really be an important part of reshaping these public policy discussions. And I'll tell you one thing that I think would be a really nice shift in how we look at local, state, and national government. Do y'all use the word stakeholder in Illinois? Stakeholder meetings? Like, could you go the whole rest of your life without going to a stakeholder meeting? I think the shift that needs to happen is we need to look at each other more as partners. There's a lot of benefit in working with the nonprofit community and I didn't realize this when I was in local government. I just saw it as another community interest out there. Nonprofits actually enjoy the highest trust levels of the public of any sector right now. In fact, people still trust us at all, so that's noteworthy. A good nonprofit, in particular one that's nonpartisan, can offer a really important third-party endorsement on things that are happening at the local level. And when you work with the right ones, you can get a partner in the mix that actually helps solves problems. And so one of the things that we do, because cities rarely have time for this, is we make sure that when we're working with the local communities and they're pairing these interesting solutions in there, we write about it all the time. We put we write op-eds, and we help communicate to the community the value of those partnerships and the creativity of those solutions. And these are the kinds of things that I think we're going to have to be thinking about going forward. So I'll leave you with this thought. We're all in it together, right? It's all public service. Those of you that are in the program are embarking on a really neat career path. I promise you, it'll stand the test of time. Even if you don't stay in city government, there's plenty of room to roam in public service, plenty of room to roam. You can spend a whole lifetime navigating in and around public service, either in the public sector or the private sector. Several of you here have made that transition, or the nonprofit sector. But keep it as an element in your professional life. You'll find that the meaningful aspect of it becomes more and more important to you. And then the challenge for all of us is shaping different kinds of conversations. We've gotten it real wrong And those of us that are really trying to be conscious and conscientious about public service have got to proactively and intentionally work on reshaping the really difficult conversations that we're having in the public sector right now. So let me stop there and see if anybody's got any questions. Comments, yes?